14-year-old Elijah Whitehorse froze mid-step on the barn's rotting threshold, his grandmother's patchwork quilt clutched against his chest, as 700 silhouettes materialized along the Wyoming ridge like vengeful spirits against the blood-orange dawn. They weren't soldiers. They were something far more terrifying. His grandfather's coffee cup shattered against the porch planks behind him, the crash echoing across the valley as the old man's weathered face went ashen. Women clutched children. Men reached for rifles that hadn't been fired in years. Inside the barn, Grace Morningstar stirred beneath the very quilt that had kept her alive through 3 nights of fever, her 16-year-old frame so fragile it seemed the autumn wind might carry her away. Yet somehow, impossibly, she had whispered his name when he'd never told her what it was. "Get away from that barn, boy!" Captain Blackwater's voice cracked like a whip from the ridge. But Eli planted his boots deeper into the straw-scattered earth, his young shoulders squaring against an entire horizon of armed figures. What did 700 strangers want with a dying girl and a boy's act of kindness? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 days earlier, Mercy Falls had been dying as slowly as autumn leaves turning brittle on the cottonwoods. The great mine disaster of 1886 had gutted the town like a beast tearing through bone, leaving behind empty storefronts with shattered windows and families who counted their dead instead of their blessings. Eli Whitehorse had grown up in the shadow of that catastrophe, raised by his grandfather Jeremiah in a house that creaked with more memories than timber. At 73, Jeremiah Whitehorse carried himself like a man hauling invisible chains. His weathered hands, scarred from decades underground, trembled whenever he spoke of the mine, which he rarely did. The old man had worked those tunnels for 30 years before the explosion took 47 souls in a single earth-shaking moment. Among them, or so the town believed, were Eli's parents and a dozen other families who'd made Mercy Falls their home. "Back in my day, a man's word was his bond," Jeremiah would mutter while mending fence posts or tending their struggling vegetable garden. "Now look what promises get you." He'd gesture toward the abandoned mine shaft visible from their kitchen window, its wooden frame standing like a gallows against the Wyoming sky. The old man had taken in Eli when the boy was 11, after the disaster left him orphaned, but something in Jeremiah's eyes always seemed to be looking beyond the boy, searching for ghosts or running from them. Eli had learned to read his grandfather's moods like weather patterns, the way the old man's jaw would clench when strangers passed through town. How he'd pace the porch at night, rifle within arm's reach, as if expecting unwelcome visitors. Jeremiah never spoke of what he'd seen in those tunnels the day they collapsed, but sometimes Eli would catch him staring at the mine entrance with the hollow expression of a man who'd left part of his soul buried in the dark. The boy had inherited his grandmother Martha's gentle nature and her stubborn streak in equal measure. She'd died the winter before the mine disaster, leaving behind little more than her patchwork quilt and a reputation for never turning away anyone in need. "That woman would have given her last biscuit to a hungry wolf," Jeremiah would say with a mixture of pride and exasperation. The quilt now served as Eli's only connection to the warmth he'd known before tragedy reshaped his world, before his grandfather became a man haunted by secrets, and his parents became names on a weathered grave marker. In a town where hope had become as scarce as paying jobs, Eli clung to small kindnesses the way drowning men clutch driftwood. He helped elderly Mrs. Crow Dog with her firewood, shared vegetables from their garden with families who had even less, and spent long evenings listening to Jeremiah's stories about the days when Mercy Falls bustled with miners and their families. The boy had learned that sometimes survival meant caring for others when caring for yourself felt impossible. October 12, 1889. The evening air carried the bite of approaching winter as Eli made his way to the barn for the final feeding of their two remaining horses. The sun had disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the sky painted in shades of purple and gold that reminded him of his grandmother's favorite dress. He pulled his worn coat tighter, thinking about the meager supper waiting inside, beans and cornbread, the same meal they'd shared for the past week. The barn door creaked on rusted hinges as he stepped inside, hay crunching beneath his boots. Thunder, their old gelding, nickered softly from his stall, but Belle, their mare, stood rigid with her ears pricked forward. Something had spooked her. Eli paused, listening to the familiar sounds of evening, wind through the gaps in the siding, the distant howl of a coyote, the settling of old wood. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, soft as a whisper, but unmistakably human. Behind the barn, in the narrow space between the building and the property line fence, someone was crying. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs as he crept toward the back door. His grandfather had warned him about drifters and desperate men who might rob what little they had left. But this crying held no threat. It was the sound of someone broken, someone who'd reached the end of their rope. He eased the door open just wide enough to peer outside. A girl lay curled against the fence posts like a discarded doll, her dark hair matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood. She couldn't have been much older than 16, but her face carried the hollow expression of someone who'd seen too much. Her dress, once white with tiny blue flowers, hung in tatters that barely preserved her modesty. Dark bruises marred her visible skin, and her breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. Eli had seen death before, in the mine disaster's aftermath, in the faces of families who'd lost everything. This girl was walking the thin line between this world and the next. Without thinking, he stepped outside and knelt beside her. She didn't flinch at his approach, which told him everything about how far gone she was. Most people, especially young women, would have startled at a stranger's presence. But her dark eyes simply tracked to his face with the dull acceptance of someone who'd stopped caring what happened next. "Miss?" His voice cracked on the word. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Eli could see she was trying to speak, her throat working with effort. He leaned closer, close enough to smell the sickness on her, fever and something else, something that reminded him of the mine shaft after it rained. "Thank you, Eli," she whispered, the words barely audible. The blood in his veins turned to ice water. He'd never seen this girl before in his life. In a town as small as Mercy Falls, he knew every face, every family, every story. More importantly, he hadn't told her his name. He was certain of it. "How do you—" he began, but she'd already closed her eyes again, her breathing becoming even more labored. Inside the house, he could hear his grandfather moving around, probably wondering what was taking so long with the horses. Eli looked from the girl to the house and back again. Every instinct screamed that he should get Jeremiah, should let the old man decide what to do. But something in the girl's face, in the way she'd said his name like a prayer, made him hesitate. Instead, he ran back into the barn and grabbed his grandmother's patchwork quilt from where it hung on a nail near Thunder's stall. The fabric still held the faint scent of Martha's lavender soap, even after all these years. With gentle hands, he wrapped the quilt around the girl's shoulders, lifting her just enough to get the warmth around her properly. For the first time since he'd found her, she opened her eyes fully and looked directly at him. In that moment, Eli saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his days, a recognition so complete, so knowing, that it felt like she was seeing straight into his soul. October 13th dawned gray and bitter, with clouds hanging low over Mercy Falls like a funeral shroud. Eli had barely slept, checking on the girl 3 times during the night. Each time, he'd found her still breathing, still wrapped in his grandmother's quilt, but growing paler with each passing hour. By morning light, her fever had worsened, and dark circles ringed her eyes like bruises. He was bringing her water and what little bread he could spare when the sound of approaching horses sent his heart racing. Through the barn's gaps, he watched Dr. Thomas Strongbear dismount his bay mare with the careful movements of a man who'd seen too much suffering. Behind him rode Captain Silas Blackwater, his military bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes, followed by 2 soldiers in dusty blue uniforms. "Stay quiet," Eli whispered to the girl, though she seemed barely conscious. "I'll handle this." Dr. Strongbear entered first, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the barn. At 55, he'd been Mercy Falls' only doctor since before Eli was born, delivering babies and closing eyes with equal measure of duty and resignation. But something in his manner today felt different, tense, almost fearful. "Eli," the doctor said, his voice unusually sharp, "your grandfather said you might be harboring someone sick back here." "She's not sick, exactly," Eli began. But Captain Blackwater pushed past the doctor before he could finish. Blackwater was a man who commanded attention without asking for it. Tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and pale eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw, he carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. When he spotted the girl wrapped in the quilt, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, recognition, and something that looked almost like fear. "Jesus Christ," Blackwater breathed, then caught himself. "Doctor, examine her immediately." "Doctor." Strongbear knelt beside the girl, his hands gentle despite the urgency in his voice. He checked her pulse, felt her forehead, listened to her breathing. When he pulled back the quilt to examine her more thoroughly, Eli saw the doctor's face go ashen. "Captain," Strongbear said quietly, "this is impossible." "What's impossible?" Eli demanded, stepping protectively closer to the girl. Blackwater and the doctor exchanged a look that made Eli's stomach clench with dread. Finally, the captain spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Son, this girl has mind fever. It's highly contagious, and it's been known to wipe out entire settlements." "Mind fever?" Eli had never heard the term, but something about the way Blackwater said it made his skin crawl. "A disease that comes from prolonged exposure to certain minerals deep underground," Dr. Strongbear explained, though his eyes wouldn't meet Eli's. "The symptoms match perfectly: the pallor, the fever, the breathing difficulties. We've seen it before in other mining towns." "But she's not a miner," Eli protested. "She's just a girl." "Look at her dress, son," Blackwater said, his voice gentler now but no less firm. "Look at how she's dressed. That's a dress from 3 years ago, from before the mine disaster. This girl—" He paused, as if the words were difficult to speak. "This is Grace Morningstar." The name hit Eli like a physical blow. Everyone in Mercy Falls knew that name. Joseph Morningstar had owned the mine, and his daughter Grace had supposedly died in the disaster along with her father and dozens of workers. Eli had seen her name carved on the memorial stone in the town square alongside all the other victims. "That's impossible," Eli whispered. "Grace Morningstar died 3 years ago." "We thought she did," Blackwater replied. "But sometimes in disasters like that, bodies are never recovered. People get trapped in air pockets, survive on groundwater and whatever they can find. It changes them, drives them half mad, and fills their bodies with toxins from the deep earth." Dr. Strongbear stood slowly, his face grave. "I'm sorry, Eli, but she'll need to be quarantined immediately. The fever is in the advanced stages, and if it spreads, no. The word came out stronger than Eli had intended. No, you're not taking her anywhere. Son, Blackwater's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. This isn't a request. This girl poses a danger to every living soul in this town. We've seen what mind fever can do. Whole communities wiped out in a matter of weeks. At that moment, Jeremiah appeared in the barn doorway, his face a mask of emotions Eli couldn't read. The old man looked at the girl, then at Blackwater, then back at the girl with an expression of such profound pain that it made Eli's chest ache. Jeremiah, Blackwater said formally, you understand the situation. The boy will need to be examined as well, and anyone else who's had contact with her. But Jeremiah wasn't looking at the captain. He was staring at the girl with the intensity of a man seeing a ghost. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Grace? Grace Morningstar? The girl's eyes fluttered open at the sound of her name, and when she saw Jeremiah, something like recognition flickered across her features. Her lips moved, forming a single word that made the old man stagger backward as if he'd been struck. Grandfather. The word grandfather hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and Eli watched his grandfather's weathered face crumble like old parchment. Jeremiah Whitehorse, the man who'd never shown fear during the worst storms or the hardest winters, was trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. The old man's eyes filled with tears that he tried to blink away, his calloused hands reaching toward Grace before stopping mid-air, as if touching her might make her disappear again. That's impossible, Dr. Strongbear said sharply, but his voice lacked conviction. Joseph Morningstar never mentioned his wife having family in Mercy Falls. Because Sarah never told him, Jeremiah whispered, his voice breaking on the words. She was my daughter. My Sarah. She ran away when she was 17 because I was a hard man back then. Too hard. Too proud to chase after her and beg her forgiveness. Captain Blackwater stepped forward, his pale eyes narrowing. You're saying this girl is your granddaughter? That Sarah Morningstar was your daughter? Jeremiah nodded slowly, unable to take his eyes off Grace. Sarah had my wife's eyes, green as spring grass. And Grace, Lord help me, she looks just like her mother did at that age. His voice grew stronger, more certain. I watched her grow up from a distance, never had the courage to approach. Joseph was a good man, treated my Sarah well, but I was too ashamed of how I'd driven her away to ever— Grandfather, Grace whispered again, and this time she tried to sit up. Eli quickly moved to support her, keeping the quilt wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes, which had been unfocused with fever, now held a clarity that was almost startling. You came to the mine that day. I saw you running toward the entrance when it collapsed. The blood drained from Jeremiah's face. You remember that? I remember everything, Grace said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Papa pushed me into the old shaft entrance, the one they stopped using years ago. He said to hide there until the shaking stopped. But it never stopped, did it? The whole mountain came down. Captain Blackwater was watching this exchange with an expression Eli couldn't read, something between fascination and growing alarm. Miss Morningstar, he said carefully, you've been missing for 3 years. Where have you been? How have you survived? Grace's eyes shifted to the captain, and something in her gaze hardened. In the dark places, in the old tunnels that connect to the current mine, there are chambers down there, natural caves with underground streams. Papa had shown them to me once, said they were our secret places, where the Cherokee used to hide from soldiers. Underground for 3 years? Dr. Strongbear's voice was skeptical. That's medically impossible. The human body couldn't survive. I wasn't alone. Grace interrupted, and her words carried a weight that made everyone in the barn go still. There were others, workers who survived the initial collapse. We took care of each other as best we could. Others? Jeremiah's voice was barely a whisper. Who? What others? Grace's eyes found her grandfather's, and in them Eli saw a pain so deep it made his chest ache. 14 men survived the cave-in, grandfather. 14 men who've been living like moles in the dark, afraid to come out because... She looked directly at Captain Blackwater now, and her voice took on an edge sharp as a blade. Because they know the mine collapse wasn't an accident. The temperature in the barn seemed to drop 10 degrees. Captain Blackwater's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his sidearm, and Dr. Strongbear took a step backward. Even the horses seemed to sense the sudden tension, shifting nervously in their stalls. "That's a serious accusation," Blackwater said, his voice carefully controlled. "The official investigation concluded that the collapse was caused by natural gas buildup. These things happen in mining operations." "The official investigation was a lie," Grace replied, struggling to her feet with Eli's help. Despite her weakness, there was something formidable about her now, something that reminded Eli of his grandmother Martha when she'd set her mind to something. "I was there, Captain. I saw what happened before the explosion. I saw who planted the charges." "Charges?" Jeremiah's voice cracked like a whip. "What charges?" Grace swayed on her feet, and Eli tightened his grip on her arm. Papa had been asking too many questions about the mine's finances, about missing gold shipments and falsified production reports. Someone wanted him silenced, and they didn't care how many innocent men died to make it happen. Dr. Strongbear cleared his throat nervously. "Miss Morningstar, you've been through tremendous trauma. Sometimes the mind creates narratives to make sense of—" "Don't!" Grace's voice was quiet but fierce. "Don't you dare tell me I imagined what I saw. 14 good men have been living in hell for 3 years because they're afraid to come forward, because they know that whoever murdered Papa and the others is still out there, still in power." Captain Blackwater stepped closer, his face a mask of professional concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Even if what you're saying is true, these men you claim survived, why haven't they come forward? Why hide in abandoned mine shafts when they could have sought help?" "Because they trust you about as much as they'd trust a rattlesnake," Grace shot back. "Because some of them saw you at the mine the day before the explosion, Captain. Saw you talking to the same foreman who later turned up dead in the wreckage with a bullet in his skull instead of cave-in injuries." The silence that followed was deafening. Eli felt as though he'd stumbled into something far larger and more dangerous than a sick girl needing help. He looked at his grandfather, hoping for guidance, but Jeremiah seemed lost in his own thoughts, staring at Grace as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "You're talking about murder," Dr. Strongbear said finally. "Multiple murders. Do you understand the gravity of what you're suggesting?" "I understand that 47 families were told their loved ones died in an accident when they were actually murdered for gold," Grace replied. "I understand that 14 men are still alive down there, afraid to breathe surface air because they know it might be their last breath." Captain Blackwater's patience finally seemed to snap. "Enough of this nonsense. Doctor, examine her for the fever. If she's as sick as she appears, she needs immediate medical attention, and these delusions are clearly symptoms of advanced illness." "They're not delusions," Eli said suddenly, surprising himself with his own boldness. "Everything she said. It explains why my grandfather won't talk about the mine disaster, why he looks guilty every time someone mentions it, why he's been living like a man waiting for Judgment Day." All eyes turned to Jeremiah, who seemed to age 10 years under their scrutiny. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with 3 years of carried guilt. "She's telling the truth about the explosion. I was there. I saw the charges being set. Dr. Strongbear's face went white. Jeremiah, what are you saying? I'm saying I was a coward, the old man replied, his hands shaking as he spoke. I saw what was going to happen, and I ran. I could have warned people, could have saved lives, but I ran because... His voice broke completely. Because Captain Blackwater told me that if I ever spoke about what I'd seen, they'd make sure Sarah suffered before she died. The barn erupted in chaos. One of Blackwater's soldiers moved toward his weapon, but the captain held up a hand to stop him. Grace gripped Eli's arm so tightly he winced, and Dr. Strongbear began backing toward the door. "You old fool!" Blackwater snarled, his mask of civility finally slipping. "You should have kept your mouth shut." "Maybe," Jeremiah said, straightening his shoulders with something that looked like relief. "But a man can only carry so much shame before it kills him. And I'd rather die telling the truth than live another day with blood on my hands." Outside the barn, Eli could hear the sound of approaching horses. Many horses. Through the gaps in the siding, he saw dust clouds rising from multiple directions, as if riders were converging on their property from all points of the compass. Grace saw them too, and despite her weakness, she smiled. "They're coming," she whispered. "The families, the survivors, they're all coming." They came like a tide of ghosts returning to claim the living. First a dozen riders cresting the eastern ridge, then 20 more from the south, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth like thunder before a storm. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the hills surrounding Jeremiah Whitehorse's property were black with silhouettes, men and women on horseback, families in wagons, and countless figures on foot, all converging on the weathered barn where truth had finally broken free from 3 years of enforced silence. Eli watched through the barn's gaps as the crowd swelled beyond anything he'd ever imagined. These weren't random drifters or curiosity seekers. These were the families of Mercy Falls dead, and their faces carried the hollow-eyed determination of people who'd been waiting years for justice. Mrs. Elena Crow Dog sat ramrod straight in her wagon, her 3 surviving children clustered around her like chicks seeking shelter. Behind her came the Johnsons, who'd lost 2 sons in the mine, followed by the Martinez family, the Stones, the Clearwaters, names from every headstone in the Mercy Falls Cemetery. "How did they know to come?" Eli whispered to Grace, who was leaning heavily against him despite her efforts to appear strong. "Word travels fast in small communities," she replied, her voice carrying a bitter wisdom that seemed too old for her 16 years. "Especially when that word is about justice finally coming home to roost." Captain Blackwater had positioned his 2 soldiers at the barn's main entrance, their rifles held ready but not quite raised. The captain himself stood in the center of the barn like a man calculating odds, his pale eyes darting between the approaching crowd and the faces of those trapped inside with him. Dr. Strongbear had retreated to the far corner, his medical bag clutched against his chest like a shield, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. "This is madness," Blackwater muttered, then raised his voice to address Jeremiah. "Old man, you have no idea what you've set in motion. These people want blood, and they'll tear this whole place apart to get it." "Maybe that's what this place needs," Jeremiah replied, his voice steadier than it had been in years. "Maybe we need to tear down the lies before we can build anything worth keeping." The sound of approaching footsteps made everyone turn toward the barn door. A woman's voice, clear and strong, called out from just beyond the entrance, "Jeremiah Whitehorse, we know you're in there. And we know you have Grace Morningstar with you. We're not here to hurt anyone, but we're not leaving without answers." Eli recognized the voice. Mrs. Rebecca Strongheart, whose husband had been one of the mine's shift supervisors. She'd been the unofficial leader of the family's group ever since the disaster, the one who'd organized memorial services and pushed for investigations that never seemed to go anywhere. If she was here, it meant the entire community had mobilized. "Let me talk to them," Grace said, attempting to step toward the door. But her legs buckled, and only Eli's quick reflexes kept her from falling. The fever was taking its toll despite her moments of clarity, and her skin had taken on an alarming pallor. "You're not going anywhere," Eli said firmly. "You can barely stand." "Those people have been grieving for 3 years," Grace insisted. "They deserve to hear the truth from someone who was there." Captain Blackwater laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "The truth. Girl, you're half dead from fever and talking about mine shafts that flooded years ago. Even if anyone believed your wild stories about survivors, what proof do you have? What evidence beyond the ramblings of a sick child?" Grace's eyes blazed with sudden fury. "You want proof?" She reached into the torn pocket of her dress and pulled out something that made Dr. Strongbear gasp audibly. It was a piece of metal, twisted and blackened but still recognizable as part of a timing mechanism. "This is from one of the charges that brought down the mine. I cut it out of the wall of Papa's office after the explosion, before the whole section collapsed." Jeremiah stepped closer, his eyes widening as he examined the device. "I remember seeing the foreman, Thompson his name was, carrying something just like this the day before the explosion. He said it was new safety equipment for monitoring gas buildup." "Safety equipment that explodes on a timer," Grace said bitterly. "How convenient." The crowd outside was growing restless. Voices could be heard calling for the captain to come out and face them, demanding answers about the investigation, asking why no one had ever been held accountable for the disaster. Someone, it sounded like Mrs. Strongheart, was reading aloud the names of the dead, her voice carrying across the valley like a prayer or a curse. "This is getting out of hand," one of Blackwater's soldiers said nervously. "Captain, there's got to be 300 people out there now. Maybe we should—" "We should what?" Blackwater snapped. "Run? Hide? Let a bunch of grieving families dictate how justice is served in this territory?" He turned to face Grace directly, his expression calculating. "Even if that device is what you claim it to be, it doesn't prove I had anything to do with the mine disaster. Anyone could have planted those charges." "Anyone except the person who benefited from the mine's closure," Grace shot back. "Anyone except the person who made sure the investigation was rushed and superficial. Anyone except the person who's been living well off stolen gold while families starved." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Dr. Strongbear was shaking his head slowly as if trying to wake himself from a nightmare. "Grace, you're talking about conspiracy and murder on a massive scale. Do you understand what that means? Do you realize how many people would have had to be involved?" "Not as many as you'd think," she replied. "Just a few key people in the right positions. A corrupt captain willing to look the other way for enough gold. A doctor willing to falsify death certificates and declare inconvenient survivors mentally incompetent. A foreman desperate enough to plant explosives for the right price." "That foreman died in the explosion," Blackwater pointed out. "Dead men don't collect payment." Grace's smile was cold as winter wind. "No, but they also don't live to tell tales about who hired them. Very convenient, don't you think?" Outside, the crowd had begun to chant. Not angry shouts, but something more unsettling. They were reciting the names of the dead over and over, like a litany of the wronged demanding recognition. The sound rolled across the landscape with the weight of accumulated grief, and Eli felt the hair on his arms stand up. "They're not going away," he said quietly. "Even if you could get past them, Captain, where would you go? This isn't just Mercy Falls anymore. Word's spreading to other territories, other mining towns. People are asking questions about other accidents and investigations that went nowhere." Jeremiah was studying the timing device Grace had produced, turning it over in his weathered hands. "I may have been a coward 3 years ago," he said slowly, "but I wasn't blind. I saw Thompson meeting with someone in Army uniform the week before the explosion." Couldn't see the face, but the build was right. He looked up at Blackwater. The timing's right, too. That's when you first arrived in Mercy Falls, claiming to be investigating territorial security. Coincidence, Blackwater said, but his voice lacked conviction. A lot of coincidences, Grace observed. Your arrival, the explosion, the rushed investigation, the missing gold shipments that were never properly accounted for. How much did you steal, Captain? How much blood money did it take to buy your silence about what really happened in those tunnels? The sound of horses approaching at a gallop made everyone freeze. Through the barn's gaps, Eli could see a new group of riders approaching, but these weren't families or townspeople. These were soldiers in full uniform, their weapons prominently displayed and their faces grim with purpose. Reinforcements, one of Blackwater's men said with obvious relief. But Grace was smiling again, and this time her expression held something that looked almost like triumph. Look closer, she said. Those aren't Captain Blackwater's men. As the new arrivals drew closer, Eli could see that Grace was right. The lead rider wore the insignia of a colonel, and his bearing suggested someone accustomed to command. More importantly, the way Captain Blackwater's face had gone ashen suggested these weren't the reinforcements he'd been expecting. "Colonel Ironwood," Blackwater said stiffly as the new arrivals dismounted. "I wasn't expecting Territorial Command to take an interest in this situation." "I'll bet you weren't," came the colonel's dry reply from just outside the barn. "Captain Silas Blackwater, by order of the Territorial Governor, you are under arrest for embezzlement, conspiracy, and 47 counts of murder in connection with the Mercy Falls mine disaster." The words hit the barn like a thunderclap. "Doctor." Strong Bear actually staggered, his medical bag falling from nerveless fingers. Blackwater's soldiers looked uncertainly between their captain and the new arrivals, clearly unsure where their loyalties should lie. "This is preposterous," Blackwater sputtered. "On what evidence? Based on whose testimony?" "Based on the testimony of 14 men who've been living in those tunnels for 3 years, Colonel Ironwood replied as he stepped into the barn. He was a man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Men who watched you and your accomplices plant those charges. Men who've been afraid to come forward because they knew you had the power to silence them permanently. Grace let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "They made it out," she whispered. "The others. They finally made it out." "Just this morning," the colonel confirmed. 14 survivors of the Mercy Falls disaster, led by a man named Samuel Clearwater, emerged from the old mine complex with enough evidence to hang every person involved in this conspiracy. The world seemed to tilt sideways for Eli. Samuel Clearwater, that was Mrs. Clearwater's husband. The man whose funeral he'd attended 3 years ago. The man whose widow was probably somewhere in the crowd outside, still believing her husband was dead. "Impossible," Dr. Strongbear stammered. "I examined those bodies myself. I signed the death certificates." "For men who were already dead when you examined them," Colonel Ironwood said grimly. "Men killed after the explosion to tie up loose ends. The real Samuel Clearwater and 13 others have been living in the natural cave system that connects to the mine, surviving on underground streams and whatever food they could scavenge. They've been documenting everything, every conversation they overheard, every piece of evidence they could find, every detail of the conspiracy that cost 47 innocent lives. The revelation struck the barn like lightning, and in its aftermath came a silence so complete that Eli could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Samuel Clearwater, alive, 14 men, alive, 3 years of grief based on lies, 3 years of families mourning husbands and fathers who had been hiding in darkness, afraid to return to a world controlled by their would-be murderers. But the silence shattered when Mrs. Elena Clearwater's scream pierced the air from somewhere in the crowd outside. It was a sound that contained 3 years of accumulated agony, a wail that seemed to tear itself from the very depths of her soul. Other voices joined hers, wives calling their husbands' names, children crying for fathers they'd believed dead. The collective keening of a community that had been systematically lied to about the most fundamental truth of all, who was alive and who was dead. Captain Blackwater stood frozen in the center of the barn, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that looked like resignation. Dr. Strongbear had collapsed onto a feed bucket, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs or might have been laughter. The man who had signed 14 false death certificates, who had helped perpetuate the greatest lie in Mercy Falls history, looked like he was coming apart at the seams. "Where are they?" Grace whispered, struggling to stand despite her obvious weakness. "Where are the survivors? I need to see them. I need to know They're safe," Colonel Ironwood assured her. "We have them in protective custody until this matter is resolved. They're weak, malnourished, and traumatized, but they're alive, and they're ready to testify about everything they witnessed." Grace's legs gave out completely, and Eli caught her as she collapsed. But she was smiling through tears that streamed down her fever-flushed cheeks. 3 years, she sobbed. 3 years I thought I was the only one left. 3 years of thinking I failed to save anyone. "You saved yourself," Eli said softly, helping her sit on a bale of hay. "And now you've saved everyone else, too." The barn door burst open as Mrs. Elena Clearwater pushed past the soldiers, her face a mask of desperate hope and terror. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but she moved through the barn like a force of nature, her dark eyes scanning every face until they locked onto Colonel Ironwood. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice cracking with emotion. "Is my Samuel really alive? Really alive after all this time?" "It's true, ma'am," the colonel replied gently. "Your husband has been leading the other survivors. He's the one who finally convinced them it was safe to come forward." Mrs. Clearwater let out a sound that was part sob, part laugh, part prayer. She pressed both hands to her mouth as if trying to hold in emotions too large for her small frame. Behind her, other family members began flooding into the barn. Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Martinez, a dozen others whose faces Eli recognized from years of memorial services and graveside vigils. "You bastard," Mrs. Johnson said quietly, staring at Captain Blackwater with eyes that burned like coals. "You let us bury empty coffins. You let us grieve for 3 years while our men were trapped underground like animals." "The situation was complicated," Blackwater began, but his words were cut off by Mr. Martinez stepping forward. "Complicated?" The man's voice was deadly quiet. "My boy, Juan, asked me every night why Papa didn't come home. Every night for 3 years. And you're telling me it was complicated?" The weight of collective grief and rage in the barn was becoming suffocating. Eli could see Captain Blackwater's soldiers growing increasingly nervous as more family members pressed inside, their faces showing the accumulated pain of years spent believing their loved ones were dead. Dr. Strongbear looked like he wanted to disappear entirely, his medical bag clutched against his chest like armor that wouldn't protect him from what was coming. "There will be a full investigation," Colonel Ironwood announced, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "Captain Blackwater, Dr. Strongbear, and anyone else involved in this conspiracy will face justice under territorial law. The families will receive compensation, and the men who survived will receive the medical care they need." "Compensation?" Mrs. Clearwater's voice was bitter as winter wind. "What compensation could possibly make up for 3 years of believing my husband was dead? What money could give back the nights my children cried themselves to sleep? Grace tried to stand again, and this time she managed to stay upright long enough to address the crowd. "Mrs. Clearwater," she said, her voice weak but clear, "your husband saved my life more times than I can count. He and the others, they kept me alive when I wanted to give up. They're heroes, all of them." "Heroes who couldn't come home because of him," Mrs. Johnson spat, pointing at Blackwater. "Heroes who had to live like moles in the ground while he got rich off their supposed deaths." Captain Blackwater finally found his voice, though it came out strained and defensive. "You don't understand the pressures I was under. The territorial government needed results, needed someone to blame for the mining disasters. If the truth had come out about the gold theft, about the corruption in the territorial offices, it would have destroyed your career," Jeremiah interrupted, speaking for the first time since the colonel's arrival. "So, you decided to destroy 47 families instead." The old man stepped forward, and Eli was struck by how different his grandfather looked, as if admitting the truth had lifted a weight from his shoulders that had been crushing him for years. "I was a coward," Jeremiah continued, addressing the crowd of families. "I saw what was going to happen, and I ran instead of warning people. I've carried that shame for 3 years, but it's nothing compared to what this man has done." Dr. Strongbear suddenly looked up from his hands, his face streaked with tears. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely audible. "God help me, I didn't know they were still alive. Blackwater told me they were already dead when I examined the bodies. He said I was just making it official, making it clean for the families." "You signed death certificates for men you knew were alive," Mrs. Martinez accused. "No!" Strongbear stood abruptly, his medical bag falling to the floor. "I signed certificates for bodies that were brought to me, bodies that had been prepared. I thought they were mine victims. I swear on my medical oath, I thought I was examining the real Samuel Clearwater, the real Martinez, all of them." Colonel Ironwood stepped forward. "Doctor, are you saying the bodies you examined were not the miners?" "They must have been," Strongbear stammered. "They had the right injuries, but now that I think about it, some of the wounds didn't match what I'd expect from a cave-in, and the decomposition was wrong for the timeline." A horrified understanding began to dawn on the faces in the barn. If the bodies Dr. Strongbear had examined weren't the missing miners, then who were they? How many more people had died to maintain Captain Blackwater's lie? Grace swayed on her feet, and Eli quickly moved to support her again. "The drifters," she whispered, her face pale with shock. "Men who came looking for work. Men with no families to report them missing. Blackwater had them killed and used their bodies to fake the miners' deaths. That's impossible," Dr. Strongbear said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The dental work? The personal effects? Easy enough to fake," Colonel Ironwood said grimly. "We've seen similar tactics used by corrupt officials in other territories. Kill drifters and transients, plant identifying objects on them, and suddenly you have bodies to close an inconvenient investigation." The magnitude of the conspiracy was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just about mine safety or even theft. This was about systematic murder on a scale that left everyone in the barn struggling to comprehend it. Captain Blackwater hadn't just stolen gold and caused a mine collapse, he had orchestrated the deaths of dozens of innocent people to cover his tracks. "How many?" Mrs. Clearwater asked, her voice hollow. "How many people died to keep this secret?" "We're still investigating," Colonel Ironwood replied, "but based on preliminary evidence, we believe at least 20 additional men were murdered to provide bodies for the fake death certificates." The number hung in the air like a curse. 20 more deaths. 20 more families somewhere who would never know what happened to their loved ones. Eli felt sick to his stomach, and he could see similar expressions of horror on the faces around him. Grace suddenly gripped his arm with surprising strength. "The gold," she gasped. "Where's the gold he stole? If he's been living well for 3 years, there must be a fortune hidden somewhere." All eyes turned to Captain Blackwater, who had remained silent during the latest revelations. His face had taken on the gray pallor of a man who knew his fate was sealed. "The gold is gone," he said finally. "Spent, invested, hidden in accounts across 3 territories. Even if you arrest me, you'll never recover it all." Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "Our husbands died protecting that gold. They died because they wouldn't let you steal it without a fight. And now our husbands are coming home," Mrs. Clearwater added, her voice growing stronger with each word. "They're coming home to see justice done." The revelation about the stolen gold hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, but it was Grace's sudden collapse that shattered the moment of stunned silence. She crumpled to the barn floor despite Eli's attempts to catch her body convulsing as fever racked her frame. The girl who had been strong enough to confront her family's murderer was now fighting a battle against her own failing body and losing. Dr. Strongbear moved instinctively toward her, his medical training overriding the shame and horror of his complicity. But Mrs. Clearwater stepped between him and Grace, her face hard as granite. "Don't you touch her," she said quietly. "You've done enough damage." "She's dying," Strongbear protested, his voice cracking. "Whatever I've done, whatever mistakes I've made, I'm still a doctor. Let me help her. The way you helped our families for 3 years," Mrs. Johnson's voice was acid. "The way you helped us bury empty coffins while our husbands starved in the dark?" Eli knelt beside Grace, cradling her head as her breathing became increasingly labored. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that reminded him sickeningly of the mine shaft entrance, dark, lifeless, touched by death. "What's wrong with her?" he demanded, looking desperately between the doctor and Colonel Ironwood. She was getting stronger. She was talking. She was fighting back. "Exhaustion," Dr. Strongbear said from where he stood, blocked by the wall of grieving family members. 3 years of malnutrition, exposure, and stress. The human body can only endure so much before it simply gives up. Grace's eyes fluttered open, and she gripped Eli's hand with what little strength she had left. "The others," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of voices in the barn. "I need to see the others. I need to know they're really safe." "They're safe," Colonel Ironwood assured her, kneeling on her other side. "But right now you need medical attention, real medical attention." "Not from him," Grace said, her gaze finding Dr. Strongbear across the barn. "He signed my death certificate once already. I won't give him the chance to make it true." The words hit the doctor like physical blows. He staggered backward, his face crumpling as the full weight of his actions finally seemed to register. "I didn't know," he repeated, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Dear God, I didn't know you were alive." "But you knew something was wrong," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had finally found his courage. "You knew the bodies didn't match the timeline. You knew the injuries were wrong. But you signed the papers anyway because it was easier than asking questions." Captain Blackwater, who had been silent during Grace's collapse, suddenly laughed, a bitter sound that made everyone in the barn turn to stare at him. "Look at you all," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Standing there in your righteous anger, acting like you're so much better than me. But where were you when the territorial government was demanding answers? Where were you when corrupt officials in Denver were threatening to shut down every mine in the territory if someone wasn't held accountable? So you decided to murder 47 innocent people," Mrs. Martinez said, her voice deadly quiet. "I decided to make the hard choices that none of you had the stomach to make," Blackwater shot back. "The mine was unstable anyway. It would have collapsed eventually, probably killing more people. I just accelerated the timeline." The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream could have been. Even his own soldiers were staring at him with expressions of horror and disgust. One of them actually took a step backward, as if proximity to Blackwater might contaminate him. "You accelerated the timeline," Colonel Ironwood repeated slowly. "You accelerated the deaths of 47 people for political convenience." "For the greater good," Blackwater insisted. But his voice was beginning to crack. "For the stability of the territory. For the protection of investments that kept hundreds of families fed and housed across 3 states. Grace tried to sit up, and Eli helped support her, though he could feel how much effort the simple movement cost her. "The greater good," she repeated, her voice filled with quiet fury. "Tell that to my mother, who spent 3 years believing her husband and daughter were dead. Tell that to Mrs. Clearwater, who raised her children alone while their father hid in caves. Tell that to the 20 men you murdered just to provide bodies for your lie." "Your mother," Blackwater said, and something in his voice made everyone freeze. "Yes, let's talk about your mother, shall we?" A new chill filled the barn, one that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Grace's grip on Eli's hand tightened, and he could see fear replacing anger in her eyes. "What about my mother?" she whispered. Captain Blackwater's smile was the most terrifying thing Eli had ever seen. "Did you really think I'd leave loose ends? Did you think I'd let the mine owner's widow live to ask inconvenient questions about her husband's death?" The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She doubled over, gasping as if the air had been driven from her lungs. Mrs. Clearwater let out a soft cry of horror, and even Dr. Strongbear looked stricken. "You're lying," Grace said, but her voice held no conviction. "You're lying to hurt me. Sarah Morningstar died 6 months after the mine collapse," Blackwater continued relentlessly. "Officially, it was grief. A broken heart, they said. Very tragic, very romantic. In reality, it was a small dose of mercury in her tea, administered over several weeks until her body simply gave up." Jeremiah Whitehorse let out a roar of rage that seemed to shake the barn's rafters. The old man lunged toward Blackwater with surprising speed, but Colonel Ironwood caught him before he could reach the captain. "You bastard!" Jeremiah screamed, struggling against the colonel's grip. "She was my daughter, my little girl." "She was a liability," Blackwater said coldly. "Just like her husband. Just like anyone who asked too many questions about the mine's finances." Grace had gone completely still in Eli's arms. When she finally spoke, her voice was eerily calm. "You killed my mother. I protected the interests of the territory." "You killed my mother," she repeated, and this time her voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the barn. "You murdered my father. You murdered 47 innocent workers. You murdered 20 innocent drifters. And you let me live for 3 years believing I was the only survivor." "I let you live because you were a child," Blackwater said. "A traumatized child whose testimony would never hold up in court. I let you live because you were no threat to anyone." Grace smiled then, and it was perhaps the most chilling expression Eli had ever seen on a human face. "No threat?" she said softly. "Captain, I think you've made a serious miscalculation." She reached into her dress pocket again, but this time she didn't pull out a piece of timing device. Instead, she produced a small leather journal, its pages yellowed and worn but still intact. 3 years in those caves gave me a lot of time to write," she said. "A lot of time to document everything I remembered, everything the survivors told me, every detail about the conspiracy that murdered my family." Captain Blackwater's face went ashen. "That's impossible. No one could have survived down there with writing materials." "Papa's office had supplies," Grace said simply. "And Samuel Clearwater taught me how to make ink from charcoal and water. 14 men, Captain. 14 witnesses who watched you plant those charges. 14 men who heard you give orders to kill anyone who tried to escape. And 1 girl who spent 3 years writing down every word they remembered." She held up the journal, and Eli could see that every page was covered in neat, careful handwriting. Names, dates, conversations, locations where bodies were buried. Everything, Captain Blackwater. Every single detail of what you did to my family in this town. The captain stared at the journal as if it were a poisonous snake. Even if that's true, it's the word of traumatized survivors against a decorated military officer. No court would— No territorial court, perhaps, Colonel Ironwood interrupted. But this matter is going to federal court now, and federal judges tend to take a dim view of military officers who murder civilians for profit. Grace's strength was failing again, and she slumped against Eli's shoulder. But she managed to hand the journal to Colonel Ironwood with steady fingers. "Everything you need is in there," she whispered. "Every name, every crime, every lie. Make sure they pay for what they did." "They will," the colonel promised, accepting the journal with something approaching reverence. "I give you my word, Miss Morningstar. Justice will be done." "Justice?" Grace repeated softly. Then her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed completely, her breathing becoming so shallow that Eli had to put his ear to her chest to make sure her heart was still beating. "She's dying," he said desperately, looking around the barn at the faces staring down at them. "Somebody help her, please." Dr. Strongbear started forward again, but this time it was Colonel Ironwood who stopped him. "Doctor, given your involvement in this matter, I think it would be best if we brought in a physician from outside the territory." "She doesn't have time for that," Strongbear protested. "Look at her. She has hours at most." Mrs. Clearwater knelt beside Grace, her experienced hands checking the girl's pulse and breathing. As a mother of 5, she'd nursed her share of sick children through dangerous fevers. "He's right," she said quietly. "Whatever else he's done, he's right about this. She's barely holding on." The moral complexity of the situation settled over the barn like a shroud. The only doctor available was a man who had been complicit in covering up the murder of Grace's family. But without medical intervention, the girl who had exposed the truth might die before she could see justice done. It was Grace herself who resolved the dilemma. Her eyes fluttered open one more time, and she looked directly at Dr. Strongbear. "Help me," she whispered. "Whatever you've done, whatever mistakes you've made, help me live long enough to see them brought to justice." The doctor's face crumpled, and tears began streaming down his cheeks. "I will," he promised, dropping to his knees beside her. "I swear on everything I hold sacred, I will save you, if I can." As Dr. Strongbear began examining Grace with gentle professional hands, Captain Blackwater laughed one final time. "Even if she lives," he said, "even if I'm convicted, do you think this ends anything? Do you think the corruption stops with me? I'm a small fish in a very large pond, and there are bigger predators than you can imagine swimming in these waters." Colonel Ironwood's response was quiet but filled with steel. "Then we'll drain the pond, Captain, one fish at a time." 1 year later, the autumn sun cast golden light through the windows of the newly rebuilt Mercy Falls Community Center, illuminating faces that had learned to smile again. Grace Morningstar sat in the front row, her hand intertwined with Eli's, watching as Judge Harrison delivered the final sentencing in what newspapers across 3 territories had dubbed the Mine Conspiracy Trial. Her recovery had been slow and painful, but Dr. Strongbear's medical care, performed under constant supervision and monitored by federal physicians, had pulled her back from death's door. "Captain Silas Blackwater," Judge Harrison intoned, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you have been found guilty on 67 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, theft of federal property, and corruption of public office. This court sentences you to death by hanging, to be carried out at the territorial prison within 30 days. A collective exhale swept through the packed courthouse, as if the entire community had been holding its breath for months. Grace felt Eli's hand tighten around hers, and she squeezed back, tears streaming down her cheeks, not of sorrow, but of relief so profound it felt like being reborn. Behind them, Mrs. Elena Clearwater sat with her husband Samuel, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. The man who had emerged from 3 years underground looked older than his 45 years, his hair prematurely gray and his face bearing lines that spoke of unimaginable hardship. But his eyes were alive again, and when he looked at his wife and children, the love there was bright enough to light the darkest cave. "Doctor," Thomas Strongbear, the judge continued, while your cooperation with federal investigators and your testimony were instrumental in securing these convictions, your role in falsifying death certificates and covering up these crimes cannot be overlooked. This court sentences you to 10 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after 5 years if you continue to assist in related investigations. Dr. Strongbear, who had aged a decade in the past year, nodded solemnly. He had spent every day since Grace's collapse working to atone for his crimes, providing free medical care to the mine survivors and their families, donating his entire savings to a victims fund, and cooperating fully with every aspect of the investigation. It wouldn't bring back the dead or erase the years of suffering, but it was a start. As the court session concluded and people began filing out, Grace felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Jeremiah Whitehorse, her grandfather, his weathered face soft with emotion. The revelation of their family connection had been one of the few bright spots in the darkness of the trial, and learning that her mother had spoken of him often, that Sarah had regretted their estrangement but had been too proud to reach out, had helped heal wounds in both their hearts. "How are you feeling, granddaughter?" Jeremiah asked, using the title that still brought tears to Grace's eyes every time she heard it. "Like I can finally breathe," she replied honestly. "Like I can finally start living instead of just surviving." Eli helped her to her feet, and together they walked outside into the crisp autumn air. Mercy Falls had been transformed over the past year. The recovered gold, most of which federal investigators had managed to track down and seize from Blackwater's hidden accounts, had been distributed among the victims' families and invested in rebuilding the town. New businesses had opened, families had moved in, and the abandoned mine had been converted into a memorial park where families could remember their lost loved ones. But the greatest transformation had been in the people themselves. The 14 mine survivors had slowly readjusted to life above ground, though all of them bore psychological scars that would never fully heal. Samuel Clearwater had become something of a spokesman for the group, working with territorial officials to ensure that mining safety laws were strengthened and that corporate accountability measures were put in place to prevent future tragedies. "Grace!" a voice called out, and she turned to see Mrs. Rebecca Johnson approaching with her teenage son, Michael. Mrs. Johnson's husband had been one of the 14 survivors, and their reunion had been particularly emotional because Michael had been only 11 when his father died. The boy had grown up believing himself fatherless, and readjusting to having a parent again had been challenging for both of them. "Mrs. Johnson," Grace smiled, genuinely happy to see the woman who had become like a second mother to her. "How is Mr. Johnson today?" "Having a good day?" Mrs. Johnson replied, though Grace could see the worry lines around her eyes. "The nightmares are getting less frequent, and Dr. Henley thinks the new medication is helping with the anxiety." Dr. Martin Henley was the federal physician who had been brought in to replace Dr. Strongbear, a kind man in his 60s who specialized in treating trauma survivors. He had been working with all the mine survivors, helping them cope with what he called underground syndrome, a condition similar to what soldiers experienced after prolonged combat, but complicated by the unique psychological effects of 3 years spent in darkness. "That's wonderful news," Grace said, and meant it. The survivors' mental health had been as much a concern as their physical recovery, and seeing them slowly heal had been one of the most rewarding aspects of the past year. As they walked through the town square, Grace marveled at how different everything looked. Where once there had been boarded-up storefronts and empty lots, now there were thriving businesses and well-maintained homes. The memorial garden, where the mine entrance used to be, was particularly beautiful, with native wildflowers and a granite monument listing all the names of those who had died, both the original mine victims and the innocent drifters who had been murdered to cover up the conspiracy. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it's the same place," Eli said, echoing her thoughts. At 15 now, he had grown several inches taller, and his voice had deepened, but he still had the same gentle soul that had compelled him to help a dying girl with nothing but his grandmother's quilt. "It's not the same place," Grace replied. "It's better. It's what it should have been all along if people like Blackwater hadn't poisoned it with their greed." They paused at the memorial garden, where fresh flowers had been placed by the monument. Grace knelt and placed her own bouquet, autumn chrysanthemums in her mother's favorite colors, at the base of the stone where Sarah Morningstar's name was engraved. The revelation about her mother's murder had been devastating, but it had also brought a strange kind of peace. For 3 years, Grace had blamed herself for not being able to save her parents. Learning that her mother's death had been deliberate murder rather than grief-induced illness had lifted that burden of guilt, even as it added a new layer of sorrow. "I still miss her every day," Grace said softly, her fingers tracing her mother's name on the cold granite. "But I'm not angry anymore. Anger was eating me alive, and I realized that the best way to honor her memory is to live the life she would have wanted me to have." Jeremiah, who had been standing quietly behind them, cleared his throat. "Your mother would be proud of you, Grace, both for your courage in exposing the truth and for your strength in rebuilding your life. Sarah always said that the measure of a person isn't in how they fall, but in how they choose to get back up." "Speaking of getting back up," Eli said with a grin that reminded Grace why she had fallen in love with him, "I have something to show you." He led her to the other side of the memorial garden, where a new building was under construction. And the sign in front read, "Mercy Falls Educational Center, opening spring 1891. Grace had heard about the plans for a new school and library, funded by the recovered gold and territorial education grants, but she hadn't realized how much progress had been made. "It's going to be beautiful," she said, admiring the solid brick construction and large windows designed to let in plenty of natural light. "That's not what I wanted to show you," Eli said, his excitement barely contained. "Look at the cornerstone." Grace squinted at the carved stone, and her breath caught in her throat. Engraved in elegant script were the words, "Dedicated to the memory of Sarah Morningstar, who believed that education could light even the darkest places." Tears blurred her vision as she turned to stare at Eli. When did you?" "I talked to the Territorial Education Committee," he said, his cheeks flushing with pride and embarrassment. "I told them about your mother, about how she used to read to you and teach you about Cherokee history and traditions. I thought she should be remembered for who she was, not just as another victim." Grace threw her arms around him, not caring who might be watching, and kissed him with all the gratitude and love in her heart. When they finally broke apart, she saw that a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Clearwater, Mrs. Johnson, several of the mine survivors, and dozens of other community members who had become like family over the past year. "Speech!" someone called out, and others took up the cry. "Speech from Grace!" Grace felt her cheeks burning, but she stepped up onto the low wall surrounding the memorial garden so everyone could see her. The faces looking back at her were filled with affection and respect. People who had watched her grow from a traumatized, half-dead survivor into a young woman who had helped bring justice to their community. "A year ago," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp air, "I was dying in the darkness, believing I was the only person left who remembered the truth about what happened to our families. I thought I would die with that truth, and that the people responsible would never face justice." She paused, looking out at the faces of the people who had become her chosen family. But a 14-year-old boy with a kind heart and his grandmother's quilt proved me wrong. Eli Whitehorse saved my life, not just by keeping me warm, but by showing me that there were still good people in the world worth fighting for. Eli's face turned red as beet, but he was smiling broadly. And then all of you, every single one of you, proved that goodness isn't rare or precious. It's everywhere, in people who choose to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous. Mrs. Clearwater wiped tears from her eyes, and her husband Samuel nodded approvingly. These were people who understood the cost of standing up for truth. "The men who murdered our families are facing justice now," Grace continued. "But more importantly, we've rebuilt something beautiful from the ashes of their crimes. We've created a community based on truth instead of lies, on compassion instead of greed." She gestured toward the construction site behind her. "This school will teach children that knowledge is power, that education can prevent future tragedies, and that the truth, no matter how painful, is always preferable to comfortable lies." As the crowd began to applaud, Grace felt a profound sense of completion. The frightened, dying girl who had whispered, "Thank you, Eli," in a stranger's barn was gone, replaced by a young woman who had found her voice and her purpose. The future stretched ahead of her, bright with possibility. College in Denver, perhaps, or teacher training so she could return to work in the new school. Marriage to Eli when they were both ready. Children who would grow up in a world where justice mattered and truth prevailed. But for now, it was enough to stand in the golden autumn sunshine, surrounded by people who had chosen love over hate, hope over despair, and truth over convenient lies. It was enough to be alive, to be home, and to know that sometimes, just sometimes, good people really do win in the end. The sound of distant church bells drifted across the valley, calling the faithful to evening service, and Grace smiled as she remembered her mother's favorite saying, "The Lord works in mysterious ways, but His ways always lead toward love." Looking around at her rebuilt community and her chosen family, Grace finally understood what her mother had meant. Friends, as we reach the golden years of our lives, we understand that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the moments when love triumphs over darkness. Eli Whitehorse was just 14 when he chose compassion over comfort, wrapping a dying stranger in his grandmother's quilt. That simple act of kindness didn't just save Grace Morningstar's life, it exposed decades of corruption and brought justice to an entire community. Like many of you who lived through the civil rights era, Vietnam, and countless social upheavals, Eli discovered that ordinary people possess extraordinary power when they choose to act with courage and love. Grace's 3-year survival in those dark tunnels mirrors the resilience you've shown through economic hardships, family losses, and personal struggles. Her grandfather Jeremiah learned that it's never too late to choose truth over comfortable silence, just as many of you have found the strength to forgive old wounds and rebuild broken relationships. The rebuilt Mercy Falls represents what's possible when communities choose hope over bitterness, something your generation understands deeply. Sometimes the smallest gestures of kindness create the biggest transformations, proving that your acts of love, no matter how simple, have the power to change the world. Discussion questions. What small act of kindness from your past had unexpectedly large consequences? How has your family or community rebuilt itself after facing a major crisis or injustice? Share your story in the comments below. Your wisdom matters.